Hi, welcome if this is your first time, and welcome back if you are returning. I'm so happy that I get to share this space with you today. Though I'm feeling under the weather, I wanted to come here and be with you. There's a lot going on, and I didn't want everything going on to be a reason for me to stop. So I'm showing up for my parts. I'm showing up for me and the intention that I set. And maybe I'm showing up for you today or in this moment whenever you find me in this message. So I'm going to forego grounding practice just because I don't want to cough or do something unpleasant in the middle of it. I did want to talk about what it's been like for me to be someone who has always had a spiritual side or has always been aware of it, and sort of my journey to where I am now. And so I will say that growing up, I was raised by a mother who was both very faithful in her Mahayana Buddhist practices and faith. She was also a medium, a reader, and it made my life feel like a magical realism book. I've had this conversation with some when I feel like it's appropriate to share this part of me. Um, but when I think of magical realism, I think of the mundane, the regular everyday things you do, like brush your teeth and cut vegetables. Um, the mundane feels magical, and the magical things feel mundane or normal or just a typical part of the day. So perhaps it's seeing orbs or um, feeling the energy of a loved one who's physically transitioned. And so having my mom as my mom, I think I always just felt like there was a world, there were realms or dimensions. Even if I couldn't tap into them, I believe that they were there and that they were a possibility. And so I didn't quite understand what was happening when I was a child. And then it was probably like my tweens or like really early teenage years when I got my hands on some astrology books, Western astrology. And so sort of I dove into that and I explored that and always was curious about my Pisces nature for a while. I thought it was a Pisces Aries cusp because I know some people talk about cusps. And then a few years ago, I was listening to an astrology reader, an astrologist, and they were saying, no, even if you're born at like 29 degrees, 40 minutes, you're still whatever that sign is. So I was like, okay. So some of the things that I have explored in the very many years since I've been a teenager. But astrology connected me to something bigger. And even though I didn't understand or see what my mom saw, it was never a question that there were possibilities, right? And so when I went off to college, I I don't know if I explored my spiritual side as much. I might have just been trying to figure out my identity. Who was I in this world? As I was experiencing more of it, meeting people from different states, from different countries, from different cultures, living abroad, studying abroad in another country. Right. And so figuring out who I was seemed to be the theme of my years in college. And then when I left college and I graduated and I was looking for work and sort of the next stages of the checklist, I want to say that people, right, then became um, a vehicle for me to explore it. There was a particular person who I'll call a soul connection. And it was, I guess I hadn't met someone who I felt that way about since I was a tween. And so I was exploring and curious because at the time I was pretty much an atheist, right? As an atheist, since my sophomore year of high school, when I had a history teacher say that all religions were created to control people. And I was in my rebellious phase and I was like, I don't want to be controlled. No. Um, so I was about 24. No, I was about 22, 23, and I met this person, and it was just this odd feeling of like, I know you, even though I don't know you and you don't share much. Like, oh, we're very similar in some ways and similar in other ways. And you're like me, but times three. And seeing you and seeing this person, right, helped me to reflect on those parts of me. Whereas I think maybe in some of my other relationships, including a romantic relationship that I was in at the time, um, him pointing things out to me usually made me feel really defensive and hurt. And so I wasn't really able to engage with it very much. And so meeting and interacting with this person made me wonder, like, maybe there is something bigger. And so I started to identify as agnostic, and I was still continuing to sort out who I was as I was exploring like the workforce and what I should do and like what is the ideal job for me, something that still eludes me, but for some reason I still believe it's out there. And so just a lot of, these life experiences happening at the time where I'm having these other kinds of experiences. And so I would say that in 2014, I I went through a yoga teacher training program, and it was really because I wanted to learn more about healing and healing modalities. And so I had a chance to learn about things and be exposed to like Ayurveda and Qigong and alternative e- alternative medicine, Eastern medicine. Um, and so I was able to tap into these possibilities that I didn't know about or didn't know much about. It was also meeting different people with different experiences and different curiosities and different modalities themselves. And so after I finished my yoga teacher training and I was curious about how that would fit into my life, I also went through a breakup, and in that breakup, not knowing how to navigate the loss and the grief that I was experiencing, I just dove into my work and in whatever ways that I could do to stay busy. I felt like I did not have the capacity to mourn and to grieve that loss. And so, in that, I came across a book called Only Love is Real by Dr. Brian Weiss. And in it, he speaks of hypnotherapy and also of past life regression therapy. And after reading the book, one of my friends and I, we went to a sound bath. And at the sound bath, there was a bulletin board, and she found a coupon for a hypnotherapist, a flyer. And so I picked up the flyer and I went online and I wasn't able to justify the rates at the time, but she also offered community classes. And so I signed up to attend a small group past life regression therapy session, and it surprised me. I didn't know what to expect. And it was the start of a beautiful healing journey and also a relationship with another woman of color who was doing this work and who was tapping into other realms and other possibilities. And so I worked with her for a couple of years before I started a life coaching certification program. And so during that time, I took a pause with her, and there was just this diving into like myself and learning, seeing just the hurt and the pain that, I was working to un undo. I don't know, just the act of avoiding that grief and that loss had a lot of consequences, and so I was still working through those. The life coaching was so helpful because not only did I feel seen and heard and understood, and almost like um, I felt I was in the textbook the way it was written. I felt like it spoke like me, and I'd never found a textbook ever where that was the case. Not only was there that, but in using the skills in and being um, someone who was coached by my cohort members, there was so much healing. There was so much power, and there's so much possibility that I finished that program and I was so proud, and I was just like, how do I make this happen? How do I turn this into my livelihood? Um, and then my timeline would take me to health issues that spiraled because I worked too much and I gave too much of myself without taking care of myself. And I made the executive decision in 2019 to leave the organization that I had worked for over 8 years. And the hope was to start a coaching business. And March 2020 happened, there was a lockdown, and it felt like the loss of my dream because I was just thinking like, I don't know if I'm going to survive this like sickness. How can I possibly work towards starting a business and finding clients? Like it didn't make sense, and I was definitely in survival mode. And then my father would transition physically in October, and just somehow in that space I gave myself permission to grieve and to feel, and it opened up a whole new aspect of me that I just had lost for so long. And it would be over a year um, before I would kind of find myself and be present in what was going on. And it was around um, the end of 2021 when I met my twin. And it was really interesting, especially because I recently talked with a friend about this, talking about my timeline. And right before my twin came into my life, I had resigned to be my mother's caregiver. I had resigned to sort of like live this life exactly the way I was doing it every day Um, and there wasn't like a sadness, and there wasn't like a happiness. It was just kind of there. It's like, well, I guess this is my life. And and then I kind of surprisingly reconnected with this person that I would later discover or identify as my twin. Um, but meeting and like having him in my life, you know, we would we talked about different books that were really important to us, like The Alchemist by Paulo Coelho and The Little Prince by Antoine de Saint Exupéry. I'm sorry, I don't speak French and cannot attempt to pronounce that correctly. Um, but then we also discovered that we are both like Reiki practitioners, and that sort of opened up possibilities in ways neither one of us was expecting. And so this connection was unfolding essentially. Um, and these experiences that I'd never had, and I don't think he had ever had, um, we were like collecting like these moments and these experiences, right? Um, I think it was October 2022 when I had a session with my hypnotherapist slash spiritual mentor. And I was talking about some of the confusion that I was experiencing around my twin. And so she was like, why don't we try to see if, there's a lifetime where we can find out some more information, about this relationship. I was like, okay. And so that was the session where I was like, oh, wow. Um, Essentially, it felt like I went to my soul's current, my soul's birth, like the initial, okay, I'm going to exist. And I could feel my presence and I could feel my twin's presence. And the way that I described it was like a rainbow sherbet that was yellow, green, and blue. My essence was yellow and his essence was blue, but there was also shared consciousness, um, which was the green. And so we had had experiences up by that time where what one of us was feeling, the other one was feeling. And we had no idea until we like talked about it randomly. Um, and so afterwards, maybe in March or April, I would find a YouTube channel at Magnetize Yourself um, that was explaining this journey in a way that I could understand. And so that was around the time where I was like, oh, maybe I'm on a twin soul journey. Um, and so the other piece that I want to share is that in 2023, I did an online course and there was a Zoom component, and I met one of my dear friends um, through it, and we were connecting and talking. We were also talking about how, like, as women of color, um, the guidance and the information, the books, the podcasts, right? A lot of the times it feels a little bit disconnected from who we are because the experiences or maybe the framework or um, just some of the understanding isn't always there or doesn't is not as inclusive, right? And so there's been this underlying question that I've had around like what does it mean for someone to explore and to wonder about spirituality um, when their experiences and their lives are very different from most of the teachers out there, right? And so I think having found the hypnotherapist who I identify as and I refer to as my spiritual mentor was a huge and foundational part for me to really establish and to allow myself to develop spiritually. I um, continue to reach out to her, and we have um, a relationship that continues. And I think with my own personal growth, when I was talking about like, oh, I'm trying to figure out who I am, like identity in my 20s, in my 30s, it might have been like trying to figure out how to like establish myself. But then there was sort of the disruption because of COVID and the passing of my dad. And so my 40s, right, has been a different iteration, a different stage in all of this. Um, Meeting the person that I would refer to as my twin was also a significant marker because I really do, as I have a chance to move forward and reflect on it, I do believe that he catalyzed my spiritual awakening. I don't think I would ever have considered an awakening before him. There was a lot of collection of information and learning and being exposed to all these different modalities and learning, to be a practitioner for a couple of them. Um, but I don't think it was until like 2022 where I was like, oh, I'm capable of having these experiences on my own, and really being able to see where I am in the mix. But then I think, this started late in my late 30s. Now that I'm in my early 40s, there is there's a medium that I worked with, and she said at the time, it was 2015. She said, "You're meant to live a spiritual existence. You're not ready yet. You're kind of on the fence, but when you make the decision, you're not going to turn back." And so I think for me, I'm still like stepping into that and embodying it. It's just because I've been doing this mostly alone. Um, I've been moving at my own pace, right? But I share all of this in the case that you have been someone who has had the inclination, who has experiences that you wonder about and don't know who to talk about. I am very often the person in people's lives who can affirm, yeah, that's totally possible, totally makes sense to me. I get it. Um, I've talked to people who experience that. I know people who have experienced that. I've experienced that, right? And so, really, just wanting you to know that if you have the side of you, or if you've had experiences and either it was shamed out of you, if it was beaten out of you, um, if you just didn't have guidance, um, I want you to know that you're not alone, and there are people, and there are more and more people, especially with the connections that we can make because of the internet, um, that there are communities out there, and there are people who have experienced or who would be accepting, right, of what and who you are. And so I'm curious if there are modalities, situations, stories where you've experienced something quote unquote spiritual. And if you feel like sharing that with me and the community, um, I welcome it with open arms, and again, just to normalize, right, that there are people who have spiritual gifts, and we don't always have teachers and guides around us. But with, you know, um, the internet and YouTube and just finding Reiki practitioners or whatever modality you're interested in, um, I really hope that we can be more accepting of who we are and these gifts that we have. And so, thank you for being here. Thank you for listening to me and for sharing your energy. And I look forward to hearing from you and to sharing space next time. Until then, take good care. Okay. Bye-bye.